Hidden crime stories. The Gilgo beach killer. The Rex Heuermann story. He was eating pizza in a parking garage in Manhattan. An ordinary Tuesday. An ordinary lunch. A man in a suit, finishing his meal, doing the thing that millions of people in New York City do every single day without a second thought, throwing away the crust, the napkin, the paper plate. He had no idea that the crust he discarded into a public trash can would end one of the longest, most agonizing unsolved mysteries in the history of American law enforcement. For more than a decade, the families of women who had vanished along a desolate stretch of Long Island Highway had been waiting for a name, waiting for an arrest, waiting for someone, anyone, in a position of authority to tell them that the person who had taken their daughters, their sisters, their mothers, had finally been found. They had been told, in various ways over the years, that the case had gone cold, that the trail had dried up, that whoever had done this had likely vanished as completely as his victims had. He had not vanished. He had been living an hour east of Manhattan, in a quiet middle-class suburb called Massapequa Park. A successful Manhattan architectural consultant, 62 years old, married, with 2 grown children. A man who went to work every day in the city. A man whose neighbors waved to him from their driveways. A man who, by every visible measure, was simply living an ordinary American life. Investigators matched DNA from that discarded pizza crust to genetic material extracted from highly degraded hair fragments found on the remains of his victims. His name was Rex Heuermann. He was charged with killing Melissa Barthelemy, 24, Megan Waterman, 22, Amber Costello, 27. And as the investigation widened, the true scope of what he had done became almost impossible to comprehend. In April 2026, Heuermann pleaded guilty to 7 murders and admitted to an 8th. In June 2026, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole, just days ago. On Hidden Crime Stories, we walk through one of the most haunting and recently concluded criminal cases in American history. A case that spanned more than 30 years, confounded investigators across multiple jurisdictions, and ended with a sentencing hearing so raw, so filled with decades of accumulated grief and rage, that the families of his victims openly called him a monster to his face in a courtroom just days before this episode was recorded. This is the story of the women who were taken, the investigation that almost gave up, and the architect who built an entire second life out of violence, hidden so completely that even his own family says they had no idea. Stay with me. Rex Andrew Heuermann was born on September 13, 1963, in Massapequa Park, New York, a quiet village on the south shore of Long Island. Childhood acquaintances recalled him as a mama's boy who was extremely close to his mother, whom they characterized as controlling. His father, a World War II veteran, died in 1975 when Heuermann was just 12 years old. He grew up, by most accounts, in the same town he would eventually use as the base of operations for an extraordinary campaign of violence. He purchased his childhood home from his mother in 1994, settling into the very house where he had grown up, building a career, building a family, building a life that from the outside looked entirely unremarkable. He became an architectural consultant in Manhattan. He commuted into the city. He built a professional reputation. He married. He had 2 children, who grew into adults alongside him, sharing meals with him, celebrating holidays with him, knowing him as their father in all the ordinary ways that children know their fathers. None of them, according to everything that has emerged from this case, had any idea what he was doing on the side. Because Rex Heuermann had been killing women since at least 1993, possibly earlier. On June 6, 2024, Heuermann was arraigned and charged with the murders of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Costilla. Costilla's murder had not previously been linked to the Gilgo Beach serial killings, and this development extended the timeline of the case back to the early 1990s, much earlier than previously believed by investigators. He had been doing this for 30 years. He had built houses for a living, and in the early hours and quiet corners of a life that nobody around him questioned, he had been systematically ending the lives of women who society had already, in too many cases, decided were not worth looking for. To understand the full weight of what Rex Heuermann did, you have to understand who his victims were, because the way this case unfolded for over a decade says something deeply uncomfortable about whose disappearances get investigated urgently and whose do not. Maureen Brainerd Barnes of Norwich, Connecticut, was 25 when she disappeared. She was last seen on July 9, 2007, telling people she planned to spend the day in New York City. She was not seen again. She worked as a seasonal telemarketer and had turned to sex work when she could not find other employment. She was a mother of two. She advertised on Craigslist to pay her mortgage. She had been out of the sex industry for 7 months, but returned after receiving an eviction notice. Her body was found in December 2010. She had been restrained with 3 leather belts, and DNA found on one of those belts would eventually be matched to Heuermann's own wife, recovered from a household item he had used in the murder. That single detail, DNA from his own wife's belt, used to bind a murder victim, tells you everything about how completely Rex Heuermann had compartmentalized the two halves of his existence. He was bringing instruments of violence directly out of his family home and back again, undetected, for years. Melissa Barthelemy was 24, Megan Waterman was 22, Amber Costello was 27. The women had disappeared in 2009 and 2010. All 3 were sex workers whose bodies were found in Gilgo Beach in 2010. Their bodies were bound at the head, midsection, and legs by burlap. In December 2010, Suffolk County Police found the remains of Barthelemy, Costello, Brainerd Barnes, and Waterman on a quarter-mile stretch of Ocean Parkway while searching for a different missing woman named Shannon Gilbert, and announced that a serial killer was operating on Long Island. In March and April of 2011, authorities discovered the remains of Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, a toddler named Tatiana Dykes, and Karen Vergata. In December 2011, Shanann Gilbert's own remains were found in a tidal marsh nearby, her death ultimately ruled an accidental drowning, unrelated to the other killings. What had begun as the search for one missing woman had unearthed an entire graveyard. Sandra Castilla's remains were found in 1993 in the Hamptons, more than 60 miles from Gilgo Beach. Karen Vergata's remains were found in 1996 on Fire Island, more than 20 miles east. The geographic spread, the years separating each discovery, and the demographic profile of the victims, predominantly women in sex work, women whose disappearances were too often met with institutional indifference, meant that this case sat unsolved, agonizingly, for more than a decade. The families never stopped looking. They never stopped asking, and for years, nobody had an answer to give them. The Suffolk County District Attorney's Office set up a new task force in January 2022, a decision that would finally, after more than a decade, give this case the dedicated, sustained investigative attention it had always deserved. The task force used digital forensics, a truck description, familial DNA, and burner phone records to connect Rex Heuermann to the killings. Detectives linked Heuermann to a pickup truck that a witness had reported seeing when one of the victims disappeared in 2010. This was painstaking, methodical work, the kind that doesn't make for dramatic television but represents the actual texture of how cold cases get solved. Cross-referencing vehicle records, following burner phone trails that led nowhere for months before suddenly leading somewhere, building a profile not from a single dramatic clue, but from the patient accumulation of dozens of small ones. On July 13, 2023, Manhattan architectural consultant Rex Heuermann was connected to the Long Island murders after mobile phone location data suggested that he shared the crime scene location with the victims. Investigators needed one final piece of evidence to confirm what the digital trail was telling them. They obtained DNA traces from a discarded pizza crust found in a Midtown Manhattan garbage can. They compared it against genetic material recovered from degraded hair fragments found on the victim's remains, preserved for over a decade specifically for the day forensic technology would advance enough to make this comparison possible. It matched. On July 13, 2023, Heuermann was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of second-degree murder. When investigators searched his digital files, they found something that made clear exactly how deliberate and premeditated his crimes had been. Prosecutors recovered what they described as a blueprint for the killings from his computer files. Among the documents was a series of checklists with reminders to limit noise, clean the bodies, and destroy evidence. An architect, a man who built things for a living, who understood structure and planning and precision. He had applied those same professional instincts to murder. Before we go any further, I need to stop for just a moment. If this story is gripping you the way I believe it is, take 5 seconds right now and subscribe to Hidden Crime Stories. Every single week we bring you cases exactly like this one. Real, deeply researched, told the way the victims and their families deserve. This case only reached its final conclusion days ago, which means you are hearing this story while it is still genuinely fresh. We have more cases like this coming that you do not want to miss. Subscribe right now. And let's get back to the courtroom, because what happened when Heuermann finally faced the families of his victims is something every person watching needs to see. As the case against him mounted through 2023 and 2024, charges continued to expand. In January 2024, Heuermann was charged with the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, who disappeared in 2007. The investigation that had begun with 3 victims along Ocean Parkway eventually grew to encompass 7 confirmed murder charges and an 8th admitted killing, spanning more than 3 decades. Heuermann's ex-wife and 2 grown children did not appear at his sentencing, choosing through their lawyers to stay away out of respect for the victims' families. That detail, a family choosing silence and absence rather than any form of defense or explanation, speaks to something that the families of his victims have had to sit with for years. The man they thought they knew, the architect, the husband, the father, had never actually existed, or had existed alongside something else entirely, something none of them had ever been permitted to see. On April 8, 2026, Heuermann pleaded guilty to the 7 murders with which he had been charged and admitted to committing an 8th. He confessed to strangling his victims before scattering their remains along Long Island's remote beaches. The plea brought something the families had waited decades for. Not just a conviction, but Heuermann's own words, finally confirming what they had always believed but had never heard him say aloud. As part of the agreement, Heuermann agreed to cooperate with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to help in the investigation of other serial killers. A strange, almost unsettling final chapter, in which the man responsible for 30 years of unexplained terror would now lend his own understanding of predatory violence to help catch others like him. He had spent the 3 years following his arrest housed alone in a segregated cell at the Suffolk County Jail in Riverhead, reading crime novels, occasionally visited by lawyers or family, and corresponding briefly with another infamous killer known as the Happy Face Killer. A man who had spent 3 decades hiding inside an ordinary suburban life now spent his final years awaiting sentencing, reading about crimes like his own. June 17, 2026, Riverhead, New York, Suffolk County Court. This is where the story your channel is telling becomes almost unbearably current, because this sentencing hearing happened just days before this episode was written. 13 family members of the victims faced Rex Heuermann directly in the courtroom. He sat in a rumpled gray suit, blue shirt, and gold tie, waiting to be sentenced. One by one, they spoke. Amanda Funderburg, sister of victim Melissa Barthelemy, condemned Heuermann as an ogre, a repulsive monster, and a demon inside and out. "I hope you take a spot in hell," she said, "because I will see you there." Violet Swager, cousin of Jessica Taylor, who would have turned 43 that very day, told him, "I can't even put into words the eviscerating hatred I have for you. You fill me with so much repugnance." Another cousin, Jasmine Robinson, remembered Taylor as fierce, kind, compassionate, beautiful, and intelligent, and told Heuermann directly, "You chose small women because you're nothing more than a weak, disgusting coward." Joanne Mack, the adoptive mother of Valerie Mack, who disappeared in 2000, told the court, "What you have done to our family is beyond what words can express." She added, "Justice has been done, but it can't replace what has been taken. She had dreams, and you took them all away from her." Maureen Brainerd Barnes's sister, Missy Cann, broke down in tears as she read her statement. "A million years isn't enough," Jasmine Robinson said. "Nothing will ever make this right." When the judge gave Heuermann the opportunity to speak, what followed was a moment that has stayed with everyone who witnessed it. "There are no words I can say," Heuermann replied. "The words I would say have no meaning." Judge Timothy Masai pressed him directly. "Are you a little bit sorry for what you did for these poor innocent women? Are you at least a little bit sorry for that?" "Yes, I am," Heuermann said. "You are a disgusting, despicable, and small man, and you are a coward," the judge told him before handing down his sentence. Heuermann was sentenced to 3 life sentences for first-degree murder and 25 years to life on 4 second-degree murder charges, all running consecutively, without any possibility of parole. As the proceeding ended, the judge said simply, "Get him out of here." Chants of ogre rang out from the family members present, followed by applause. Rex Heuermann will die in prison. He will never again walk freely through the streets of the city where he built his career, or the quiet suburb where he built his secret second life. But for the families who waited 30 years for this moment, there was no version of justice available to them that could undo what had already been taken. Before I give you my final thoughts, I want to speak to you directly for just a moment. This sentencing happened only days ago, which means this is one of the most current and significant true crime stories we have ever covered on this channel. If it moved you, if it made you think about how long these families waited for this moment, please leave a comment right now. Tell me what stayed with you. Tell me what case you want us to cover next. Your comments shape this channel and help these stories reach more people who need to hear them. And if someone in your life needs to hear this story, please share it with them tonight. Now, here is what I want you to carry from everything we just walked through. I want to say something about how long this took. 30 years. Sandra Castilla's remains were found in 1993. Rex Heuermann was not arrested until 2023. He was not sentenced until June of this year, 2026. 3 decades between a woman's death and the day a judge finally called her killer a coward to his face. I think it is important to ask why that gap was so enormous, because the honest answer says something about this case that extends far beyond Rex Heuermann himself. Maureen Brainerd Barnes turned to sex work when she could not find other employment, to support her 2 children and pay her mortgage. Most of Heuermann's victims shared something in common. They worked in an industry that society has, for generations, treated as disposable. When women in sex work go missing, the urgency with which law enforcement and the public respond has too often been measurably, demonstrably less than when other women disappear. That is not a comfortable thing to say. It is also not new information. It is something true crime researchers and advocates for sex workers have been saying for years, long before this case reached its conclusion. But the Gilgo beach killings put that uncomfortable truth into sharp, undeniable relief. A man was able to kill at least 8 women over 3 decades, in part because the systems meant to notice and respond to their disappearances were not built to take their lives as seriously as the lives of women in other circumstances. Here is the thing I want you to carry from this story. The value of a human life does not change based on their job, their circumstances, or the choices they made to survive. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was a mother of 2 who turned to sex work after an eviction notice arrived and she had run out of other options. That circumstance does not make her death matter less. It does not make the 30 years her family waited for justice any less of a failure on the part of the systems that should have found her killer years sooner. Joanne Mack said it best, standing in that courtroom days ago, "Justice was done, but it cannot replace what was taken." Valerie Mack had dreams, so did Jessica Taylor. So did Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, Sandra Costilla, Karen Vergata, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes. 8 women, 8 complete, irreplaceable lives. Taken by a man who spent his days designing buildings and his nights destroying the people that society had already, in too many ways, stopped looking for. We tell this story not because the case is finally closed, though it is, as of just days ago. We tell it because the gap between when these women died and when their killer finally faced consequences should make all of us ask harder questions about who gets believed when they go missing, who gets searched for urgently, and whose disappearance gets treated as an emergency. That gap is closing, slowly, as advocacy and awareness around this issue continues to grow, but it should never have been this wide in the first place. Rex Heuermann will spend the rest of his life in a cell. The 8 women he killed will never get the lives that were taken from them. But the families who stood in that courtroom days ago, the ones who finally got to look him in the eye and say everything they had been holding for 30 years, they did something that matters beyond this single case. They refused to let his victims be forgotten. That refusal is worth remembering. It is worth repeating. For every name we have not yet learned, for every family still waiting for an answer of their own,